everyone, it's Simi Shah, and welcome to Trailblazers. On this podcast, I dive deep into the journeys of trailblazing South Asians, sharing the stories of the leaders and dreamers lighting the way across the South Asian diaspora. Before I jump into today's episode, I want to spend a second and tell you guys about the newly launched Trailblazers Agency and Expert Network. At South Asian Trailblazers, we've long been dedicated to elevating and convening extraordinary leaders through our media platform and our community-wide events. Our agency and expert network is simply the next step toward fulfilling that mission. We're forging impactful collaborations between exceptional leaders and visionary organizations. If you're part of a company or organization looking for fresh and diverse voices to speak at your next summit, conference, or event, or represent you in a new brand campaign, please get in touch. If you're looking for someone to offer you expertise on a project that you're working on, reach out and we can plug you into our expert network of trailblazers across industries. And finally, if you're a speaker or a leader looking to connect with companies who want to share in your expertise, feel free to reach out. You can learn all about us at southasiantrailblazers.com/trailblazers-agency. And with that, let's jump into our episode. Today, I am so excited to welcome Nishant Roy, Chief Communications and Impact Officer at Chobani. Chobani is one of the fastest growing food companies over the last decade and has been a pioneer in the natural food movement. Nishant has an incredibly variegated career to date, stemming from both his time at Chobani and the U.S. Air Force and well beyond, and I can't wait to share his story with you. Nishant began his career with distinguished service in the United States Air Force as an airman, where he served with the security forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. Upon his honorable discharge, he channeled his commitment to service into a role as a domestic policy assistant at the Clinton Foundation, during which time he also completed his BA in economics from St. John's University. Upon his graduation, he spent some time at Goldman Sachs in their asset management division, and after 2 years was recruited back into public service. He joined the U.S. Agency of International Development, USAID, where he served as a special advisor during President Obama's administration. He contributed significantly to initiatives like President Obama's Feed the Future and Power Africa. Today, Nishant serves in the C-suite of Chobani, a company he joined almost 7 years ago. He initially joined as chief of staff to CEO and founder Hamdi Ulukaya. He later took on the role of chief of strategic operations before ascending to his current role spearheading comms and impact work. Nishant is an alum of NYU's Executive MBA program, as well as a team member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Nishant has an incredibly compelling story and so much wisdom to share, and I can't wait to welcome him today. Nishant, both I and the 20-some containers of Chobani in my fridge sit here very excited to have you on today. Thanks so much for being here.
Simi, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate you having me on the show, and congratulations on 7 strong seasons.
I appreciate that. Well, Nishant, I want to go back to the beginning of your professional journey, which is quite diverse from what we typically see on this podcast and within the community, broadly speaking. You started as an airman in the U.S. Air Force. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what inspired you into service and how this experience shaped your career trajectory?
Sure. I grew up in Long Island, New York. My family had immigrated to the United States from India in 1979. I was born soon after in 82. We first started in Queens and made our way to Long Island. My family felt they were on the strong pursuit to make sure that their kids were set up for a strong foundation of education. In all honesty, I did not make the most of that because I was having a lot of fun during high school. I was involved with a lot of different friend groups, social groups that were at school and whatnot. I would go to school, would not often go to class. And I realized as I was coming upon graduation that I need to do something a little bit different. I wanted to take a completely different path. And we had over 200 folks graduate in our graduating class. And there was only one person that had decided to enlist in the US military, and that was me. And I enlisted in the United States Air Force. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. Very, very different, of course, than what many of my classmates or even people that I had grown up with decided to go and do. But I felt like I needed to mature, get some level of discipline. This country, the United States, has offered my family and many other families so much opportunity to excel and progress and whatnot. And this was going to be my way in which to give back and feel like I'm part of the fabric of this nation.
Wow. And I'm curious, some people make the decision to try and attend an officer's academy, but you chose to directly enlist. What was the thought process behind that? You're 18 years old and you decide you're going to go serve. Did your parents balk at that decision?
Parents were not happy about the decision. At some point, they said, look, we're going to cover the cost of school. If it's a concern about the cost, don't worry about it. And it wasn't a financial decision. I said, listen, I need to travel. I need to really hone in on some disciplines. And I would really love to just understand myself a little bit better. And I really have this interest that started with my grandfather when he was in India and supporting the Royal Air Force at that time. Just this interest of like what the military can do for an individual and what it means to be a part of a team. So finally, after explaining this to my dad, he said, okay, why don't we meet with all 4 service recruiters? There's more than 4 services now. We have a Space Force, which is great. But we had met with the Marine Corps, we had met with the Army, Air Force, and Navy recruiters. And I had an interest in wanting to go into the Marine Corps. They had the coolest uniforms. They were celebrated. They were the ones that actually got to see a lot of the action. If you go anywhere across the world, it's a Marine that's at every single U.S. embassy. It's not any other service branch that's represented there. So I had this infatuation of wanting to go become a member of the Marine Corps. And my dad sat with me as we met with each one of these service recruiters. And he said, you know what, Nishant, I understand your desire to want to go into the military. I may not agree with this, but if this is what your interest is, I think you should go to one of 2 branches out of the 4 that are out there. And it's either the Air Force or the Navy. And I said, why those 2? He said, because they have the most transferable skills to the private sector. They're very focused on education. I just see that in their progression as you are serving. So he said, those are the 2 branches I would go for. And that's my recommendation. So ultimately, I sat on that. I was already frustrating my parents or disappointing them by not going directly into college. And they said, listen, your parents have nothing but the best of interest for you. Let me heed his advice. And I started to dig in a little bit more, do further diligence, and ultimately landed on joining the United States Air Force.
Wow. Now, you served a tour of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as you said, it seemed like your father was really compelled by particular divisions of the Army, just given the potential leadership and other transferable skills you'd acquire. Can you talk a little bit about those experiences serving and also the skills that you gained?
Sure. It's quite unique to go join, particularly when I joined, which was in 2000. And then 9/11 happened.
Oh my gosh.
And 9/11 changed the entire trajectory of my career cadence while serving in the military. I had joined initially to go work on satellite wideband and telemetry systems. And what that means, to put in the most layman's of terms, is you get dropped off in the middle of a remote location and you don't have access to a cell phone. How do you communicate to other forces where you are, what you're seeing? You're providing any sort of reconnaissance information. And so somebody needs to confirm all of that stuff. That's what that job was.
Wow.
Just leading into 9/11, a recruiter had come over and he had said, who wants to learn a little bit more about the United States Security Forces? Because the Air Force's Security Forces is a light infantry type of format. You get to learn a lot about weaponry. You could still continue to use your communication skills, but you deploy far more than your peers. So I said, yeah, this is what the military is all about. It's about learning about different weapons, learning about different combat skills, survival training, jump training, and whatnot. I got very, very excited about that opportunity.
Wow.
Took it, went through the training, and I remember 9/11 happening while I was going through M60 machine gun school in Texas. That day is like just so burned into my memory. They had called all of us outside after training, and they said, who's from New York? I think 3 of us had raised our hands. And the staff sergeant that was there, he had said, there was an aircraft that just crashed into the World Trade Center. Does anybody have any family that's in the area? My father happens to be a mechanical engineer who has an office not far away from Ground Zero. So I raised my hand. He said, okay, we got to get your father on the phone just so you guys can do a quick check. And in my head, I thought, it's just a small Cessna aircraft. It's not going to be anything that's of consequence. And then they brought in the TV and they showed that it was a pretty big fire. It was roaring. The second aircraft hadn't hit the second tower just yet. It started to evolve further. I couldn't get through to my folks. And so I called one of the landlines, finally got through to the secretary, and she had said, I can't even get him on the phone right now because there's chaos that's unfolding before their eyes. And I said, this is Nishant Roy. I'm calling from the United States Air Force. And immediately she's like, of course, I'm going to get Anil Roy on the phone.
Wow.
That was such a pivotal moment in my career in the military because not only did these terrorists have the audacity to attack our country, but they attacked where I was raised, my city. And I took it very personally, and I couldn't have been more proud or privileged to have volunteered to go and deploy to all of these places because I want to make sure that never happens ever again while we're serving. So I got to be actually one of the first people to go to Afghanistan. I went to Kandahar shortly after 9/11. I was deployable to go, and I spent 3 months on the ground there and later had come back home, in this case to Colorado Springs, which is going to be my new base. And later on, I had deployed to Kirkuk, Iraq, which is one of the most oil-rich cities in all of Iraq. So it was also the home of Chemical Ali, who had run the chemical weapons program for Saddam Hussein. So I spent a year on the ground over there, and it was just a fascinating experience, to be brief about it. But it was really eye-opening. I learned a ton about myself. I learned a ton about my team. I learned a ton about what the U.S. military was actually hoping to achieve and did ultimately achieve while on the ground in that time. And we were empowered with a ton of responsibility in a short amount of time. Me as a young airman, I was responsible for helping to run resources and utilities and running a town with the whole team. So it was really cool. And I got to really engage in my first throes of diplomacy and engaging with local Iraqis and local Afghans when I was in Afghanistan. So it was a ton of fun to be there.
Wow. Super interesting. And I appreciate you sharing the piece about 9/11 because in our 50th episode, we took apart some recurring themes that we've observed across the many South Asian leaders like yourself that we talked to. And one of them is the way in which 9/11 was such a pivotal moment in shaping the careers of so many. But for you to have actually been in service and have family that was in New York, I can't even imagine how much that continued to shape your worldview and your work, particularly in the Air Force.
It is fascinating as I've progressed in my career, how uncertainty and challenging environments where you have to overcome adversity present opportunities for us as individuals to excel. I had a similar opportunity later on in my career when I was back in government. I was working at this point at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Yep. There was a massive earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And the administrator, his name is Raj Shah, a fellow South Asian who now runs the Rockefeller Foundation today.
Yeah.
He looked at me and he said, Nishant, I don't know anybody else here. We just started a week and a half ago on the job at USAID. And here's a sat phone. I need you to get down to Haiti. And this was just literally hours after that earthquake. I got the opportunity to go work really closely with the ambassador as well as this 3-star general that was running U.S. Southern Command. As a part of the national security framework in the U.S. government, it's development, diplomacy, and defense is what makes it up. I got to represent development along with the State Department person who was representing diplomacy and this 3-star general. So that presented a ton of opportunity in the midst of a tragedy that took the lives of over 200,000 people. It presented a ton of opportunity to really solidify the infrastructure, public works programs, in which to bring additional safety to Haiti, which is only 2 hours away from Florida. It's unbelievable to see that level of devastation that had occurred during that moment. But I totally agree that in these moments of tragedy, it really presents a lot of opportunity for people to develop themselves and their careers and their lives.
Absolutely. I want to spend more time on your experience at USAID, but first I want to talk about your initial transition from military service. You joined the Clinton Foundation as a domestic policy assistant. Can you speak to that transition and also what it was like to attend college, coming back as a civilian and working at the foundation?
Yeah. So I'd come back from my military service. This is around 2005. I enrolled at St. John's University, which is the university in Queens, not far from my home. And I'm so grateful to St. John's University. They took me in, they gave me a free ride.
Wow.
And I was unbelievably grateful. They gave me this opportunity to graduate within 2 years, my 4-year degree in 2 years. They walked me through how we can do this really aggressive course load. And at the same time, I was really missing this itch that I always had for public service. My framework in which I think about things and most of my decisions that I've made have been on three things. One is, am I working on a bigger mission? And is it beyond just that organization? Is it a mission in which to further something much bigger? Two, am I working with a team that I can learn from? And do I feel like I'm actually contributing in a meaningful way to add value to progress these goals? And then three, do I see value? Value can be viewed in very different ways, right? In the military or in public service in general, you're not getting paid a ton, but the value that you add is really meaningful and fulfills you. Whereas on the private sector, the way to demonstrate value is through a paycheck, right? And so
returns.
Exactly. So I think that was my framework. And I was missing that service piece while I'm going to college. I was disciplined about wanting to get this 4-year degree done in 2 years. I felt the pressure because my friends had come home from college. They were now earning and they were enjoying being adults now and contributing to society. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm so far behind. And so I put a lot of pressure on myself to go finish that degree in time. And I decided to go join the Clinton Foundation. And that experience was awesome because it was just early days in the foundation. So I got a ton of time actually with President Clinton. I got to travel with him a great deal.
Wow.
And what an amazing man. He had done so many things for me along the way, little nuggets of small things, little gifts that he would provide. And at one point in time, he saw that I was a little bit frustrated, that I had this look of puzzlement on my face. And he said, "What's wrong? What's on your mind, Nishant?" This is former president of the United States. I'm thinking to myself, what kind of interest do you have talking to me about these things? But I had gotten a job offer to go work at Goldman Sachs, or I could stay at the Clinton Foundation and work in a different capacity. And he said, "You know what, Nishant, you should not do either. You should go to law school." And I said, "Why? Why do I go to law school?" And he said, "Because you already have more lived experience than your peers, given your military experience. And that coupled with a education that forces you to think outside the box, that gives you the tools to think about problem solving from a different perspective, is an unstoppable force." And I said, I love that frame, but with all due respect, I've been very focused on finishing this 4-year degree in 2 years so that I can go make some money now and contribute to society in a different way. He said, "Oh, well, what about engineering?" And I said, "Oh, I don't think the world needs another South Asian engineer, honestly." But which he laughed. At the end of the day, I said, I think private sector might be the way to move, or staying with you because it's such an amazing experience. He brought in a friend of his that had been a Rhodes Scholar and had gone to law school, the same law school as him. He happened to be a former partner at Goldman Sachs, and he explained to him the fact pattern of who I was and what I was trying to achieve and so forth. He heard the fact pattern. Within a minute, he kind of turned and looked and he said, "This is a no-brainer." He goes to work at Goldman Sachs. And he said, "Why'd you come up to that recommendation so quickly?" He said, "Because the guy needs to go make some money, one. Two, what the public sector is missing, and that's where his passion is, what the public sector is missing is this understanding of the bottom line. How does business work? How do you sustain programming? Otherwise, we're going to continue to have donor-driven execution of impact programs for the rest of our time. We need to think more like business and have these programs sustain over some period of time." That's the way in which to go do it. And then in addition to all of it, you get to be with some of the smartest people on the planet and you'll learn about business from them. So that informed my decision to ultimately go and work at Goldman. And I was there for about 3 years before I had made my transition back to government to go work in public service.
Wow.
Yeah, I decided then to go work at U.S. Department of Agriculture with Raj, and I was there for no more than 6 months before I made my transition to the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Wow. So I want to spend a second on that. 2 years into your time at Goldman, as you said, you received this call from a former colleague who's now working for Obama's administration. Can you tell us about the call and how it led to your pivot back into public service?
Raj Shah, who I don't know if you've met just yet, but he is such an amazing, talented, just one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. He had been working at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he had come to me with a couple of different problem sets that he wanted me to start to think about. So I started working on some financial modeling, and we had started to build a relationship there. He had then called me up and said, I'm going to be the chief scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, leaving Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to go do this, where he was running the ag portfolio. And I think we can make a difference here in the country on how we think about nutrition as it relates to agricultural resources and so forth. He had said, Nishant, the difference between me and probably anybody else that sat in the seat is that I'm a medical doctor. In medical training, they don't teach you about nutrition. They teach you about how to address these things once they've gotten to the points where they need to be addressed. That's what medical training is all about. But no one talks about preventative care. And a lot of that is geared on nutrition. He's like, I think we can make a difference here. And I would love for you to go and join on that journey with me. I said, I don't know anything about ag. Why do you want me to come? And he said, you're a smart guy. You can think about things in a different and practical way. We'll do some really interesting things together. So I went and joined him because he's a good salesman. And I was there for 6 months before President Obama then nominated him to go run the U.S. Agency for International Development, which was another wonderful experience for me, which I stayed there for 5 years with Raj, which I think we could have done it even longer, honestly, but it was very fulfilling to be there.
Can you share some experiences from your time working at the agency and specifically the initiatives like Feed the Future and Power Africa, which I know were very much championed by President Obama?
For your listeners that may not be familiar with the U.S. Agency for International Development, this is the foreign assistance arm of the U.S. government. Anytime you hear about a country that needs humanitarian aid and the U.S. government's committing whatever resources there are, it's usually implemented 9 times out of 10 through the U.S. Agency for International Development. Anytime there's elections that are happening overseas where they want to promote better practices, USAID is there. If you want to help think about economic assistance where we're helping empower livelihoods, that is also what USAID does. It's less than 1% of the overall federal budget in terms of the amount of money that's allocated to it. And I believe it employs about 8,000 people across the world. And so the highlights for me were I joined this agency, which I had actually grown up understanding, given all my visits to India, and my Bua, my aunt, had been a USAID Foreign Service national. So she had been a officer that was thinking about reproductive health within India. And you had HIV on the rise as more infrastructure was being developed. ARVs were needed, preventative health measures were needed. So I got to learn a ton about what this agency does and its true impact. Then separately, I looked at what happened even under Gandhi with ag. A lot of the ag initiatives were funded through US government programs, through other multi-donor partners, because most of our economies had started in a place from feeding ourselves with ag and creating value chains. And that helped improve livelihoods for people. That's how you can truly lift people out of abject poverty. So I got to travel to about 40 different countries in 4 years. And I got to look at all of our national security programming. So programs that were happening now within Afghanistan and Iraq from the USAID perspective, things that we had blown up, we had rebuilt. And now how do you sustain that over a period of time? How do you build that capacity on the ground? That was coming full circle moment for me. And that was cool. We separately had looked at agriculture, the initiative that you had mentioned, Feed the Future. We were able to get the federal government to commit $3.2 billion to support getting nations to really create their own value chains in agriculture. And that truly addresses a lot of the abject poverty that exists in some of those countries. You have countries like Bangladesh that has a high salinity of water. How do you grow crops when you have high salinity of water? That's something that needs to be remediated, or you have to come up with other ways. So I think what USAID had done effectively is started to build some additional capacity on the ground with a lot of these programs. So that was an experience, I think, that had me start to frame and think about how you could really move the needle with a small group for an entire country.
Wow.
There was also some challenging times where we were doing our assistance work in Africa, where we're building schools, we're building communities. And as we're building these schools and first aid facilities and whatnot, we saw the Chinese coming in. The Chinese had said, we're building infrastructure as well, but it's going to be to mine, set up these ports. And we said, how about taking those roads and bringing them over to where we're building the schools, because we can partner and build a capacity on the ground. Those were tough conversations. They didn't view it in the same way that we did. So
this was the Belt Road Initiative?
It wasn't called Belt Road at the time. Belt Road had come as a next step as China wanted to further expand trade throughout Southeast Asia.
Wow. Super, super interesting. I'm curious, during this time as well, while you're working for the administration, you also chose to pursue an executive MBA. What was the deciding factor for attending NYU? You'd had these experiences in service, you'd gone to work in finance, you were now working back in the administration. Why the decision then?
I had missed the private sector. I started to reflect further on the initial advice that I had gotten back in 2006 from President Clinton and Bob Harrison, who was the guy that had been in the Rhodes Scholar and had been the former Goldman partner. I started reflecting on that advice further, and I said, okay, I got to make a transition back into the private sector at some point in time so I can further develop my skills and progress my career. And then ultimately, maybe in some point in time, I'll make my way back into public sector. I'd like this kind of going back and forth mentality. That was one piece of it in the equation. The second piece in the equation was we were coming to the end of the term of the Obama administration, and I was going to have to go and compete against some of the smartest people that had been serving President Obama and Vice President Biden and the rest of that administration. And they're really, really talented folks. So I did not want to compete against them for jobs. Then I would say tertiary, I had learned a ton from a public service government perspective, how appropriations work, what it means to go to Congress, who's serving truly as a fiduciary on behalf of US taxpayers. And how do I think about this now from a business perspective? Because I'm missing out on the business aspects of things. I am going to be labeled as a government guy and not necessarily somebody that's a private sector guy or understands business. And so I felt like I had to go and do this degree in order to differentiate myself and further progress my career. I applied to a few different programs and ultimately chose NYU because it was close to home. I had missed my family. Like I said, I'd been to 40 different countries. I was living out of a suitcase, but I was also going to some of the places that nobody wants to go to. I was going to Yemen, Sudan. These are not spring break spots that you would want to go and visit, but that really shaped a lot of my view and perspective of the world and where business could be doing in terms of its power and influence. And in order to really progress that further, I definitely felt like that MBA was going to really help me with some of those skills to get there.
I love that.
Doing the EMBA program while working, wow, it is unbelievably challenging. I think that
tends to be a trend in your life.
It contributed to the gray hairs that I have today.
Well, after your time in the administration, you were recruited by the Chobani team and the famed founder, Hamdi Ulukaya. What drew you back to the private sector and specifically to Chobani after your time in public service?
I had a couple of ideas of what I wanted to go and do after my government service. I knew I was coming back here to New York. I just didn't know what I was going to do. I had built this remarkable Rolodex of people that I can call upon for advice and guidance and support. And then I thought, wow, I could potentially go work into private wealth management. So I started thinking about that. And then I started thinking about how can I take a model in which I'm engaging a ton with philanthropists and have them think differently about their giving, because I had gone through this real lesson of what business looks like and then what the public sector looks like, and where I feel like philanthropists can be playing a real value added role in terms of moving the needle. So I started supporting some of these folks on the side while I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And then Raj calls me up actually, and he says, "Hey, I'm leaving aid and I'm going to be teaching at Georgetown, and I have a number of different projects. How about we work on some of them together?" So I was doing some of that work where I still got to do philanthropic work, but impactful work that was thinking about businesses like Zipline, or thinking about how to promote economic development, even here now within the United States. And so those were a ton of fun projects. And then one day I get an in-mail message on LinkedIn from the folks at Chobani, and they said, "Hey, your background is really eclectic. Our founder thinks it's really interesting and would love to spend some time with you." So I go and meet Hamdi Ulakaya, who had come to this country in 1994 purely to learn English. And
he's an amazing story.
Yeah, his story is just truly the American dream. But it reminded me actually a ton of just what my parents had gone through, what I know so many other South Asian folks had gone through as well, is immigrate to this country, figure out how are you going to add value, how are you going to differentiate. You just have this really strong can-do work ethic. And this guy is remarkable. He speaks very minimal English, starts to learn the language, understands business intuitively, I feel, and starts a cheese business in upstate New York. He grows it, but ultimately picks up a flyer one day and finds out about this yogurt plant that's for sale that Kraft actually had previously owned. And he goes to his financial advisor and a few other folks, and he's like, "Hey, I want to go and buy this plant." And they said, "You have no money. What are you talking about?" Fast forward, he gets himself lined up with a small business administration loan. He gets that plant, and that was the birth of Chobani in 2005. And it wasn't really until 2007 that they actually have the first cup hit the shelves. Ironically enough, or coincidentally enough, in the town that I grew up in Long Island, Great Neck, New York, Chobani just takes off, reaches $1 billion in sales in probably less than 5 years. That's like tech type of growth, but it's yogurt. And he explains to me his journey, how he's gotten to where he is. And it just reminded me so much of my own family. And it reminded me so much of just the people that I had grown up with and had been around and whatnot. So it's just very familiar. And he started sharing about some of the different problem sets that he was thinking about, how to think about philanthropy and giving in a very different way. And he said, "I would love to get your thoughts on some of this stuff." And so I started sharing my thoughts, and what started in one conversation turned into about 3 months of conversations.
Wow.
And ultimately he said, "Do you want the job?" And I said, "We never talked about what a job would look like, but sure, what's the job?" And he said, "I'm looking for a chief of staff." And to me, this was like one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life.
Wow.
I got to work shoulder to shoulder with one of the smartest people as it relates to business. This guy committed, takes nothing and turns it into something, and it's meaningful, impactful, and it's like transformed, candidly, food and food businesses here in the United States. So it's amazing what impact he's even had just on this country after just having immigrated here in 94 and setting up this business in 2007. So he just taught me a ton about his framework and how he thinks about business and how he thinks about giving and what business should stand for and what role it should play. And I said, "I want to help you make all of these dreams and aspirations into reality." And so for 5.5 years, I served as his chief of staff. And candidly, I would have stayed in that role even longer. But he had said, "Listen, it's time for you to grow. You got to take on other responsibilities." And so initially he had me learn a lot more about the operations of the business at Chobani. So they moved me into this executive leadership role called Chief of Strategic Operations, where I just learned a ton about like, how is the product actually even made? What does it mean from the supply chain, manufacturing process, delivery process, etc.? Who are the biggest customers? How do we engage with them? How do we sell with them? What's that cycle look like? All of that soup to nuts. And he empowered me with a ton of responsibility in such a short period of time that it's very fulfilling to just be here. And you just feel like a young entrepreneur building something really quite meaningful.
Wow.
And then he had asked me to step into this role most recently, the communications and impact role, about a year plus ago. I have no background in communications, zero.
Yeah.
There's other than that hard technical stuff that I learned while I was in the military about satellite and wideband and telemetry systems, but that is the closest thing I've ever come to communications. This is all brand spanking new, and I did not expect at all that I would ever, in my wildest imagination, that I would ever step in a role like this. So I kind of looked at him and I said, Hamdi, we are Chobani. We have a remarkable brand. We're at a time in this company's history and this country's history where we have our pick of the litter. We can get so many more talented people to go and sit in communications and impact. Why do you want me to take on this function? He said, Nishant, the impact work and the government affairs work, which you also cover, is going to come natural to you given your background. You're going to make quite steady progress in that space. I have no doubt about that. The communications one is interesting because you have no background on it. That's not lost on me. And I want to challenge you because I want you to feel challenged. I want you to be challenged because by being challenged in your career is where innovation is born. And it's where your leadership skills like really start to hone in and evolve. So that's why I'm challenging you to take on this role. I said, wow, okay. He's right that Chobani has this kind of pristine brand recognition. And I felt like I was being given a Lamborghini to go and drive. And he's like, go drive it, test it, explore, make the most of it. I got behind that gas pedal, behind that Lamborghini. And I was like, oh gosh, I don't want to go too fast. I don't want to go too slow. So I would gently hit the accelerator and then I would stop. I would gently hit the accelerator and then I would stop.
I love this metaphor.
I did not know how I was going to get this function to really take off. And I had to really think about so many different aspects of my own leadership style. It was a real moment for me where I had been serving as an individual contributor, holding myself accountable every day on certain goals and tasks. And now I'm leading a team and taking on a function that I have no expertise in. So I started to go back to all of my lessons over the years of what it means to project manage, what it means to be a part of a team, what it means to move things along, because I wasn't always the expert in that space, but I knew enough to be dangerous and really set these milestones. So that's what really had me create a framework in which to grow and excel this function on communications. And ultimately, I feel like we're moving forward in a really fun direction.
Yeah.
And on the impact side of things, I've gotten a chance to really hone in on that portfolio and make things a little bit tighter than they were before. I think we were doing a lot of really good, meaningful work. And now we're honing in on addressing child hunger, addressing hunger in this country, but starting hyper local and finding the right models in which to ultimately scale like a business would. So it's been a really fruitful experience and journey, even here at Chobani. Now in March, it'll be 7 years.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. It's such a fascinating journey. And even as you were speaking, one of the things that's always struck me about leaders like him is I feel like they often empower people into roles and functions that they're not necessarily familiar with, because the best innovators come in as outsiders because there's no familiarity with the way things have always been done. And so you're willing to break with the status quo because you're not even entirely sure what the status quo is. And I think that often leads to some of the best innovation in industry we've seen. To that end, I'm curious, what do your day-to-day responsibilities actually entail? And what are the ways in which you've been able to both tighten the impact portfolio, but also drive communications for a company, as you said, that has a generally pristine reputation?
A lot, actually. Let me start with the impact work. The business itself has continued to grow steady year over year and really strong overall top-line revenue growth, which is largely driven by volume. I think just last year alone, our yogurt had grown about 9%. We also make a oat milk and a creamer, and closed the year by buying a coffee business.
La Colombe.
La Colombe, exactly. And as this business is continuing to grow and becoming truly like a modern food business, we started as a yogurt business, but now we're truly a modern food business. That's generating more cash for us to go out and do more impactful work. And when I look at this hyper local model, We have two communities in which we call home. We have central New York, where we have the original plant. And there, unfortunately, you have about 10,000 people that are food and nutrition insecure between these two counties, Chenango and Otsego County, 2,500 of whom are kids. And
Wow.
in Twin Falls, Idaho, which is where we have our largest plant, and actually I think it's the largest plant in America, if not the world, that's making yogurt. That plant is in Twin Falls, Idaho, and there's about 8,000 people that are food and nutrition insecure, and about 3,000 of whom are kids. What does that mean, really? That means that food insecurity in this country is not just access to food. There's an equation here. What they've boiled it down to is this thing called the social determinants of health. There is access to food as one input. There is your wages, housing, transportation, access to healthcare. All of those are drivers in reducing overall food insecurity in our country. So as a business that's producing food, we can certainly help improve food access. And I think that's our sweet spot. That's our value proposition. And we had done a lot of different things here and there, but to be far more focused, how do I actually address those 8,000 in Twin Falls or the 10,000 in central New York? We created partnerships with pantries directly that were in those communities. We created partnerships with food banks built on existing relationships that we had, and really just focused those dollars to really drive real food accessibility in the country. So we have this aggressive plan now that we pivoted towards to build further capacity in this country for our pantry system. And we're going to start in central New York. We're going to start in Twin Falls. That means that you have pantries, unfortunately, today in this country that can't operate Monday through Friday. Either they don't have the right number of volunteers to go there and support, or they don't have the distribution chain to get the food from the food bank to that local pantry, or they just don't have the funding. You have these brick and mortar locations across these counties. So if you can get food into some of the more robust, heavily staffed pantries, can these other smaller satellite pantries start to pick food from there directly and keep their hours of operation open? That's one piece of it, as in terms of addressing the problems of accessing food. The second has been, in this time in our economy where you're seeing food prices going up, where you see the cost of gas had gone up for a number of years.
Absolutely.
As a function of the Russia-Ukraine war, conflict in the Middle East in general. There's a lot of factors, obviously, that drove into oil prices being a little bit higher. But how has that affected Americans is gas prices are up. If I can't go to my local pantry because it's not open because of these infrequent hours, and I'm working a 9 to 5 job or whatever the hours are that I'm working, I don't know how to get food. I just don't. And the nearest grocery store might be 45 minutes to an hour away in some of these more rural areas. So going to the local food bank is about another 40 minutes of a drive to go and access. And that's gas money. That's less disposable income for me to go and purchase food or even get access to food. I may not have the right level of choice and dignity in that choice. So how can we improve more local capacity for people in these two communities? So I think we've been working on a model to really transform how do we think about that on a more sustained basis and coming up with models that are more hyper-local that allow for people to get food in their communities without having to drive those 40 minutes. Pivoting to the government affairs side, we don't lobby really for stuff. We're takers when it comes down to some of these things. There's 3 areas that I think we're really focused on. One is refugees. At one point in time in our company's history, 30% of our workforce, immigrants, refugees.
Wow.
And thankfully, blessings from our country, people have been able to change their status. They're no longer considered refugees, and that's a beautiful thing. Unfortunately, there were some caps on the number of refugees that we could bring into the countries over the past few years. That's since been lifted up, but that flow still, we haven't been able to maintain that 30% just yet. But our mindset is, let's get refugees a start in this country. And if they want to stay here, that's great. If they don't want to stay and move on to something else, that's perfectly fine as well. We just want to help them get started in this country, and at least they have a soft landing after going through their adversity and their treacherous journeys. So we advocate on refugee and improving the cap in terms of allowing the number of refugees and allowing for employment of refugees. The second is the plight of undocumented workers. We hear often in the news about what's going on at the southern border, about the number of migrants that are coming in from Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela, etc. You hear about these folks that are making these really challenging journeys, and they're just trying to make it to a better life because they're escaping political asylum, economic asylum, whatnot. So they're coming into this country and they're wanting to go do something. In our country today, we have a gap of about 2.5 million jobs just to feed ourselves as a country. What does that mean? That means that there are people in the country today, there are job postings that are open, but they don't want to take that job. And it's usually immigrants that want to go and do that job. And the mechanism that exists in the immigration system today is called the H-1A visa. That visa allows people to come here on a temporary basis seasonally to help with agriculture.
Yeah.
The cap on that had been so much, and I think Congress is having a bigger debate about what is our immigration policy as a country. So I think that's another thing in which we get involved with. The third, I would say, is food access. There's programs out there like SNAP, which is food stamps, EBT, the electronic benefits transfer. There's also the Women, Infant, Child program. These programs are helping improve food accessibility to those that are most vulnerable in our country. The WIC program on its own today services about 6.7 million women and infants and children that go up to the age of 5. These are the most vulnerable folks in our entire country. That program alone, by the way, has reduced child mortality by 16% in this country. Wildly successful. It's not talked about enough. And it's had a lot of bipartisan support for the last 50 plus years. But for the first time in these 50 years, we're seeing silly tactics from Congress where they have budget conversations. They're saying, maybe we don't want to go and support this. That's the government side. And then I'll just say, look, on the communications, everything we are doing in our company, from the impact work to the sustainability work, as we think about our packaging, as we think about our story of selling our products, just in general, everything we do needs to be amplified in some kind of cohesive voice. And we've been able to kind of truncate that down into some really thoughtful pillars of what it really means to be an impactful food business. And I think defining ourselves really not just as a yogurt business, but changing that narrative of us now becoming more of a food business. And I think this most recent acquisition of La Colombe has been that moment in which we get to really demonstrate to people that, we moved from yogurt to creating coffee creamers. We offered non-dairy options. So people could say, you kind of stayed in the dairy aisle. You did kind of dairy adjacent things. But now here we are going into coffee. We, as a communications team, gets to go out there into the community and share how we're progressing. I would say the final piece, obviously I want to be conscious of everyone's time, but the final piece of it, and the most important really, is how are we communicating to our own people? If I can't put together a tight message that I can share with our people, that they can use and share with their family and friends and so forth, they're the brand ambassadors. They're the ones that are actually doing all the work. I just get to amplify it. If I can't give them the right tools in which to go deliver that, then we're not doing a great job. And so I think we are now pivoting to a place where the team is actually learning a lot more about why we're producing the products that we're producing and what that means for the future of our business. And they're actually starting to generate more ideas in the process of where we could be vectoring towards next as a business. So it's a very exciting moment at Chobani.
I have to say, I'm currently a Philadelphia resident, so La Colombe is a very, very popular place for us. So I was very excited when my favorite yogurt brand acquired one of my more recent favorite coffee companies.
That brand is a remarkable brand. I don't know if you know the history, but it started in 1994 by these two founders, Todd and JP. And once Hamdi had made his investment in La Colombe, I believe in 2015, I could be wrong about the year, but it was around there. When he made that investment to go and buy 60% of La Colombe, he partnered with Todd and JP to make sure that this coffee can actually be in the hands of all Americans.
Wow.
Because he saw a lot of parallels to what was happening in the yogurt category in those early days. And he's like, we can do that with coffee. We
Wow.
can disrupt coffee, which I can speak to for far longer, but
I'm sure you can. And we will have to have a conversation on it. As truly, I'm a more recent convert because I just moved here about 6 months ago, but I love it. I have to ask, some of the issues that you spoke to, like world hunger, I think it's a lot easier to get broader buy-in, right? We believe that everyone should have access to food. But there are other issues like rights for refugees and immigrants where there's a lot more political rancor and broader polarization within our communities. How do you think about managing that from within your company and then also with external stakeholders? And also, given the reality of today and the polarization that exists, what do you consider table stakes for a comm strategy?
It's a great question. I think the best way for me to answer that actually is to share almost a quick case study. So
Yeah.
Hamdi had done a 60 Minutes episode where 60 Minutes had highlighted the number of refugees that Chobani was hiring and so forth. As a function of it, there is this like far right commentator who had said some really nasty things about Chobani and said that we were bringing some of the worst extreme elements to Idaho and Twin Falls in particular. If you think about the demographic of Idaho and Twin Falls, it's probably 90% plus conservative in terms of their politics. But what was fascinating in that moment where we got attacked, before we got a chance to even defend ourselves, before the politicians, the governor, the local mayor got a chance to defend us in the process, it was actually the people of Twin Falls, Idaho that said, "Oh, you're so wrong. That I actually know that person, or I know these people that you're claiming are bad to be the coach of my kid's soccer team. I know them to be the person that is my local barista at my coffee shop. I know them to be the person that helps me every weekend at my farm. I know them to be the person that's working at the Chobani plant and that's like contributing and paying taxes to society." So it was a very different narrative. Our country, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of political rancor and grandstanding and so forth. But our country, I will say this from my own experience at USAID, our country is one of the most generous countries in the entire world. In the moment of devastation across the world, it's not only our government that's stepping up, it's our people. Our people
Absolutely.
are the first ones to go to call it the Red Cross or text to donate the $10 that they do each time that they're texting towards a tragedy that's happening, whether it's here in the United States or somewhere abroad. We as a country are actually far more united on this issue than we are divided. In fact, just to even add an additional layer to that point is, I believe it was under President Trump, they had talked about reducing the overall refugee cap. And they said, what states would accept refugees? All 50 states actually had come forward and said, we'll take them. We'll take refugees. Everybody wants folks that have gone through the hardest of circumstances. If they can go through the hardest of circumstances and be this resilient, my God, what can they do for your community? What can they do for your society? It is part of who we are as a country, and people recognize that. I think there's a lot of grandstanding that you see on TV and read about in the paper and whatnot, but at the end of the day, if you really were to pull a member of Congress to the side and say, hey, how do you really feel about this? I think most of them would probably land on the side of course, I want to go and allow immigrants to come into this country. We're a country of immigrants. That's how we started. That's how we maintain. And you're seeing just from a geopolitical competitive basis, the more that you are restrictive in this side, the less you are setting yourself up as a country for success, because then you have just homogenized, if you will, your population. You're not allowing for innovation to come in. It is something that we as a country can do certainly a better job of communicating more of these case studies. I think people have tried to do it in different ways without having to undermine whoever's sitting as the president of the United States. I think President Bush most recently had done a really remarkable job. He's been in an interesting position. He was a former governor of Texas bordering Mexico, understood the immigration issues there. And then he was president of the United States for 8 years. Whether you appreciate his politics or don't, he understands the issues. And he's the first one to say, hey, the way we're talking about immigration is absolutely all wrong. We should be welcoming immigrants. And in fact, he just did a book where he painted, actually, this is what his life is post the presidency, but he did portraits of immigrants that have come to this country that have really up-leveled us as a nation.
Yes.
And they're part of the fabric of who we are. So it's
a beautiful book.
It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful book. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, you're leading comms and impact work at Chobani. You're a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. You're newly sitting on the board of La Colombe. What's next on the docket for you, both professionally and personally?
Professionally, I don't know. This is the interesting thing. I never actually set out with a specific plan. I had ideas of like what I wanted to go and do. And I think one thing that I learned very quickly in the military is embrace change, embrace challenges, because that's, like we were saying earlier, that's where not only the innovation comes out, but then that's also where the opportunity comes out to really find common ground, but also just find a path for yourself that you're super passionate about. I'd love to continue to think further about how to fully transform food insecurity issues in the country in a more active way. I would say personally, I'm going to continue to probably work on balancing my time. I spend a ton of time with work, but I also have two amazing girls at home who are 6 and 4.
We love a girl dad.
They're humbling. I mean, the questions they ask me, it's just a ton of fun. And I want to travel to so many different countries with them. And I want them to just see the world and experience. And I want to just provide opportunities that I had growing up, but then add to that so that they have this more fulsome, rich experience. I think that's probably my biggest priority. And outside of that, just keep learning. I am obsessed these days with the power of AI. And as is everybody, it's the hot fad, of course. But I spend probably at least 18 minutes a day learning something new about AI. And can it inform how I do communications differently? Can it give me my first draft? Can it help me think about different strategies? Can I do some of my initial research? And I get there's a whole bunch of fallacies that may exist in the infrastructure, but it gives you the bones, I think, to start thinking about it. And I'm so happy to hear that even academia is embracing AI as a tool, because I do truly think that it's the future. So I'm personally spending about 18 minutes a day, and there's a magic to that because I want to get to a big number by the end of the year on learning about AI as a whole. So that's kind of my goal right now, I would say, is continue learning personally, be a good dad, husband, of course, and then professionally, just keep walking the way. Get ready to embrace change. It sucks to change sometimes, and it feels awkward, and you feel like you're not on your right footing. But as we say in the military, embrace the chaos, because that's where you really have the opportunity to go and influence things.
I love that. Keeping in mind young South Asians, young professionals across the swath of industries that you've served in, keeping in mind your 2 daughters, what is something that you would tell the younger version of yourself, or that you wish you'd known then that you know now?
Oh, wow. So this is interesting. I grew up in Great Neck, New York, which is a predominantly Jewish population. I think what brings Jews and Hindus, what brings us together is this big focus on education, a big focus on family. And I spent more time going to bar and bat mitzvahs, Shabbat dinners than I did in my own culture. But the similarities were so strong. And I would say, first and foremost, embrace your culture, embrace your upbringing, your roots, because when I started to appreciate more about my own culture and I saw the parallels as it exists in Judaism and later in Christianity when I was serving in the military, because I don't know a single person that happens to be serving and that's on the front lines that doesn't believe in God at those points. But I would say embracing that culture really is so formative and spiritual and grounding, and it provides a ton of perspective, but also just relatability. Even if you don't ultimately believe in a certain religion and whatnot, appreciating the cultural aspects of things. In Indian culture or South Asian culture, right, we're always calling somebody brother or sister, Didi or Bhai, or uncle. Oh, everyone's an uncle, right? And or everyone's an auntie. As I got to know Hamdi, he basically does the exact same thing. He calls me brother. And that's so familiar to me. And it's so familiar to him. And it makes our connection that much deeper and stronger
Wow.
And it makes work that much easier because I'm like, oh, I'm working with my brother. It's all very familiar. He's going to get pissed about these things and he's going to be really happy about these other things. And I just know. So there's a lot of that. I think that I would say embrace your culture. I would say two is just always keep that learning journey. I was talking about this actually with my in-laws last night. We were talking about how you think about the three phases of your life. And there's this journey in the triangle of learning, earning, and then teaching. And I would say every day, regardless of age, continue to learn. Just keep finding different ways, keep curiosity out there, wonder why things are the way they are, why our systems develop the way that they are, why were politics set up in the way that they were, etc. Just challenge, question. So I would say that goes into the learning experience. And I would say, finally, really, truly embrace change. It's easy to say, so difficult to go do because you may feel like your whole world is wrecked at the moment. You may set plans, and we all set plans. Like I may have set plans to come and walk to the office, but maybe the street was closed. Well, that had me deviate my plan. Doesn't mean that the entire world has gotten completely awry, but embrace change, embrace that chaos, and find new opportunity. I love this Rumi quote that Hamdi had taught me. But there was this Rumi, who's this ancient Persian poet. He had said, when you walk the way appears. So you may not have had this kind of preordained plan, or you may know that I want to vector towards addressing food insecurity, and you may think you're going to start to walk the way of doing it on this hyper-local perspective. Well, it may open up 3 other doors in which you can really influence change and create opportunity to have even more meaningful impact at the end of the day. So embrace it. Start to walk the way, and the way will appear. I think it's a wonderful Rumi quote that I certainly live by.
Nishant, thank you so much for sharing those tidbits of wisdom and for taking the time to share your story. I mean, I genuinely feel like I could spend hours with you. So appreciate you taking the time. It's such a fascinating journey, and I know people will have so much to learn from it. So thank you.
Simi, again, thank you for having me on the program. I am so happy to be a part of this journey that you're going on. And I really am loving the content and the people that you're bringing on, putting myself aside. I'm really loving the whole program altogether. I'm just proud.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you want to get new episodes straight to your inbox, subscribe to our newsletter at southasiantrailblazers.com and follow us at South Asian Trailblazers on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.